Good day, everyone, and welcome to the BMRC Fellows Talk. My name is Tolu Balogu, and I'll be hosting today's session on behalf of Sumaya, who has been hosting these talks for a few weeks for the 2025 Summer Fellows. The BMRC Summer Short Fellowship Program is a 1 month residential fellowship in Chicago, which began in 2009. It has since engaged scholars, artists, writers, and public historians to better formulate new historical narratives of the Black experience. The fellow talk provides an opportunity for the fellows to share their research, which they engaged in during the summer while they were in Chicago as fellows. So this is the ninth presentation in the BMRC Fellows Talk series, and today we have Mariel Rowland, who's sharing with us our research. Mariel Rowland is a PhD candidate of culture and theory at the University of California, Irvine. Sorry about that. Mariel's research centers around Black feminist teaching and learning practices across time and space. She studies the pedagogical work of Black women educators who live and worked in the United States between the 19th and 21st centuries, including Emma Brown, Ada B. Wells, William, Williana Burroughs, Bernice Robinson, Mistress Velvet, and Akiea Gross. For the BMRC fellowship, she studied the Ida B. Wells paper House at the University of Chicago. Here, she focused on the pivotal year of Ida B. Wells' life as a teacher in 1886. Drawing from Wells' diary, where she expresses her discontent with teaching, Mariel asks what this period opens up for our politics and the making of pedagogy at the limits of the world. Mariel will be sharing our research today on the topic The Gaps Between, inquiry into Ada B. Wells's writing in 1886. So, Mariel, you have the floor. You can start your presentation, and I'll be back to coordinate with the audience to see if we have questions. So, you have the floor now, Mariel.
Thank you again for the introduction, and thank you to those who have joined to listen today. I really appreciate you being here to hear what I'm working on. And what I'll share with you are pieces from a dissertation chapter that's in the works. So much of the questioning and thought thinking here is still open. It's branching off as I continue to follow the research. So I just want you to know that this is quite unfinished and also part of something larger. So if you could just take a few moments to look at this slide. I know the font is small, so you might need to zoom in, but just kind of glance, skim it over, and then I'll begin. Don't worry if you have not finished it all, just get a sense of some of what I'm working with. I'm going to make it smaller again so I can see my paper, but I will make sure you can see the following slides. All right, so something is unsettled here in Ida B. Wells's writing during the year 1886 when she was employed as a teacher for the public school system of Memphis. I cut and rearranged words from a published essay on the left and interspliced them with words from her diary on the right to demonstrate this tension. In the left column are fragments from an article she wrote for a student paper called The Fisk Herald, entitled A Story of 1900. Fisk was founded 20 years earlier by the American Missionary Association. Audrey McCluskey says the AMA schools and colleges produced the majority of the Black teaching corps at this time, and for the next several generations, with Black women making up about 70% of Black teachers. I share this to orient you to the relevance and import of her article to the institution. The right column are fragments from her diary written during that same year. I put her in conversation with herself, her public writing, and her personal writing to isolate what is unsettled about the role of the Black woman teacher. The tension is between the way she writes about the duty of the teacher and the way she writes of her experience living through that role. Each utterance of what it is the teacher is supposed to represent is met with a description of isolation, belittlement, and disillusionment in her diary that same year. I am interested in both what becoming a teacher at this time demands of her and does to her being, as well as the way she navigated this particular side of violence and what it tells us about the history of Black education. Going to the unsaid, incomplete as a method of reading what is necessarily unsettled, I read through her writing during her years teaching and proposed that there are important gaps made by Wells gaps that tell us about how and where Black education is made. These gaps I am referring to are what Wells makes show up by leaving unexplained space between what I am calling the call for proof and the severe discontent and unhappiness that she experiences trying to answer it. Between her desire to, in quotes, convince the world, end quotes, and her determination to see the world itself change is where something new starts forming in her writing. This something new becomes a source of her learning. She thus is making knowledge as the teacher at the site of formal education, but not in the channel made by it. Just to briefly introduce you to my work at large, I am occupied by the way Black women educators have navigated the system of education and make visible the intertwined conditioning of gender and race. So this is a historical project that speaks to this moment, to the ways we continue to navigate these same forces in new form, and what our pedagogical work must consider as we continue. This is a deeply personal project, as it is part of understanding my own work, the work of my grandmother, and the work of women I know through text, like Wells. As I went into the physical archive, I wanted to allow myself to wander without the need to find or make use of the material in a predetermined way. I am using wander here specifically in the way Emma Brown spoke of it. She described it in relation to learning specifically as pleasure, learning through an unconfined shape where the pedagogical imperative is to go beyond. There are few opportunities in teaching or learning where I have felt this openness, where the conditions were so that I could wander without knowing the direction of my thought, or at least without concern for when it might come. As mentioned, I went into the archive attentive to Wells's wrestling with the role of the teacher in the year of 1886. As I saw her approaching the limits of the role and what she could do in it, I wanted to know what brought her close to this edge. What I have found doing this larger research for the past 5 years now is that the limits of this profession are the limits of the world. The conditioning forces that Black women educators confront are the very forces that form our world order and maintain the conditions of life. These conditions are not only made, transferred, and carried forth in education, but education is one of the primary sites for this operation, and it does so by making use of teachers, specifically Black women teachers, in particularly deceptive and harmful ways. As Althazar describes it, education is the most dominant ideological apparatus of the state, in which teachers are trapped in a cycle of making it work more efficiently. Before studying this, I had the knowledge of this primacy in my body. I went through school zones as an object in production. My promise or lack thereof was measured in relation to an abstract set of standards that were so meaningless they became powerful. What we were doing, why we were doing it, how we are made useful, is hard to understand as students and maybe never considered after getting out. The role of the teacher is meant to replicate this same process of submission that the student experiences, but by this time, the lure of authority that was formerly unavailable. But this time by the lure of authority that was formerly unavailable. And so we take it sometimes enthusiastically as a chance to be on the other side. What I am interested in, though, and what drives my research is what happens when the teacher starts to make visible that trap. What happens when they start to question and make visible the way the system of education really functions. It is only from within this position that we can feel what is going on, and it is from these feelings that so much that is meant to be said, that is not meant to be said, not meant to be considered or made into knowledge, can be thought. So let's go there to the archive where we see this tension exist and follow it. That was premature. I'll get there in 1 second. I started to see this shift in Wells' thinking on the role of the teacher from the story of 1900 in an essay she wrote in 1891, the same year she was fired. She wrote this essay for the American Association of Colored Educators, and it was entitled The Requisites of True Leadership. It is not a total departure from the story of 1900, but there are notable shifts in her thinking by this time. I wanted to understand the contours of this shift better. To answer this, I looked for what changed for her once she stopped teaching and what did not, to then return to her writing in 1886 with more insight. What I found was the force of gender making in almost every folder. It was surrounding her generationally, from her mothers to her daughters. So this is one example from the archive is after she was fired and she was on a trip through Vicksburg, Mississippi, canvassing for her journal, Free Speech. While there, a preacher remarks that, in quotes, morally, there were no virtuous Southern girls, end quote, including Wells on the evidence that she had been fired from her teaching job. She says, in quotes, I told him that my good name was all that I had in the world, that I was bound to protect it from attack by those who felt they could do so with impunity, because I had no brother or father to protect it for me. I also wanted him to know that virtue was not at all a matter of the section in which one lived, that many a slave woman had fought and died rather than yield to the pressure and temptations to which she was subjected. I had heard many tales of such, and I wanted him to know that at least one Southern girl born and bred, who had tried to keep herself spotless and morally clean as my slave mother had taught me, end quote. Another significant instance where the force of gender was showing up was in this letter to her family. I hope you can see this, but I'm going to read it if not. This one is written in 1920 while she's traveling, and she writes to let them know she will not be home for dinner as she got scheduled for a speech the next morning. She says, in quotes, my dear folks, whenever I think of my dear girls, which is all of the time, such a feeling of confidence comes over me. I know my girls are true to me, to themselves and their gods wherever they are, to their God wherever they are, and my heart is content. I have had many troubles and much disappointment in life, but I feel that in you, I have an abiding guide. I feel that whatever others may do, my girls are now and will be living examples of noble, true womanhood. And so mother's heart is glad and happy when she thinks of her daughters, for she knows that wherever they are and whatever they are doing, they are striving to please her and reach the ideal of true womanhood. I was kind of immobilized by these texts and how to read them. I think I wanted her to have no attachments to gender after she stopped teaching, hoping this could possibly happen as unrealistic and imagined as it was. These were moments in the archive where I was not sure how to understand it. Was she gripping to gender here as a form of protection, maybe the only tool she had, or was she contesting it? Was the need to understand it as such to get my own grip on gender, and if so, why? As Eve Ewing says about Wells in the foreword of her autobiography, in quotes, largely missing are general observations about what constitutes a good life, admonitions about where and how to direct our energies toward achieving social change, and grandiose statements about the nature of Blackness or of womanhood or of the American democratic project, end quote. I had to mediate my own desires by returning to the framework that my research produced, that framework of reading for what she makes visible in the gap between what she wants and what she finds, treating this as a zone for thinking and questioning instead of resolution. I'll focus now on one diary entry from 1886 to show this. In this entry, I think she tracks an internal function of the system of schooling and the position of Black women as both students and teachers. This happens while she is inside of the form, employed as a teacher, and reflecting on her time as a student. Here she brings us to the force of the gender project in education, and she does not resolve it. June 12th, 1886, on a visit back to Rust University, where she attended school before getting kicked out, Wells reflected on her experience as a student there, feeling saddened by it getting cut short. She says, in quotes, I could not restrain my tears at the sense of injustice I felt, end quote. As she continues to reflect, she contemplates why it was that she was not favored like some of her peers, saying that in the past, she considered it could be because of skin color or intellect, but now having ruled this out, she has come to understand what was really going on. In describing one of her peers, she says her different treatment must have come from, in quotes, her obedient disposition, her extreme tractableness, and therefore easily controlled, and her evident ladylike refinement. And where I think of my tempestuous, rebellious, hard-headed willfulness, the trouble I gave, the disposition to question his authority, I remember that Mr. Hooper is but human, and I no longer cherish feelings of resentment nor blame him that my scholastic career was cut short. My own experience as a teacher enables me to see more clearly, and I know that I was to blame, end quote. From the vantage point of the teacher, she sees herself as the problem and forgives Mr. Hooper for a deep-seated pain she has carried with her since Rust. From the vantage point of the teacher, her hard-headed willfulness opposes the ladylike refinement of her peer, the image of the proper student. In this passage, the tension I was tracing between her private and public writing as the teacher converge into one place. They meet at this moment where she can view herself as both the student and the teacher at once, and these locations are at odds with one another. She sees her own independent will as a problem for the project of the teacher. By setting her independent will against the obedience of a ladylike refinement exemplified by her peer, she absorbs the blame and becomes responsible for her own dismissal. In this reflection, she confronts what education wants from her. What she describes here is specifically a gendered requirement or one communicated and understood through the construction of womanhood, i.e. ladylike refinement. This is an internal mechanism within education that she reveals and does not let settle. It is from her position as the teacher, one meant to mediate one's entrance into morality, encoded through a language of gender, that she shows up to herself as outside of its bounds. It is in the gap between what she wanted from her education and what is wanted from her in education that she locates gender at work. This passage does not look like a critique of the system. It looks like quite the opposite, an internalization of pain. But simultaneously, it is a movement towards understanding the function of this requirement. She does not attack gender here. Instead, she grips to it in a way that it becomes more visible to her as a term, something at work. And she leaves it there unsettled and very present. The duality between the parts of herself that are coming up in this passage, that part that is angry and willfully so, and that part that is trying to quell that anger because it is causing internal suffering and strife, are so pronounced. They are indicative of this gap between the real and the imagined and the contestation it causes inside of herself. The conversation she produces between what is going on and what she thought would occur is that which requires her continued engagement in the maintenance of this project, and also what is driving her need to unsettle it at once. There is not a moment of overcome in this narrative of arriving at the resolve of this tension. Rather, she keeps it open, constantly tugging on it. I contend that it is in the conversation she is holding between these zones of reason that allow her to keep pushing on both. It is in the persistent unsettling that she is revealing the limits of her location. What would have been most useful for the state, however, would have been for Wells's internalization of herself as the problem to lead to a ceaseless aspiration for correction, and thus a refined comportment as the teacher. Yet, this is not what follows. A month after this entry, Wells attended the National Education Association, where she would have been a part of integrated sessions on the role of the teacher. More specifically, the sessions revolved around teachers' responsibility to the state as a moral obligation, an obligation they were to pass on to their students. Through the following excerpted speech from that convening, the tension that she is producing and that I'm following comes into sharper relief. So this is an address this is the welcome address for the National Education Association in 1886. By Han W.H. Rosington. He says, in quotes, "I understand the purpose of your organization to be chiefly to promote this great national object. If popular education is essential to the stability of our government, then the instructors of the land have resting upon them at this moment a great responsibility. For I need not tell you, as acute and observing citizens, that we are fast approaching, if we have not already approached, a crisis in our national existence. I allude, of course, to the prevalent contest between labor and capital. Pray do not suppose that I am going to hold you responsible for these disturbances, but the thought which occurred to me was that in your hands largely lay the corrective. The generation you now have in training will quickly step upon the stage. They should come to share of the world's work, not only mentally fitted to do it with success, but their moral natures should be braced, their love of country fully developed, and they should fully value and be prepared to resolutely preserve justice and public order." End quote. He goes on to explain this crisis between labor and capital as foreign influence, i.e. communism. The teacher is positioned as the basis and justification for the call to protect the state from this influence, and the role of the teacher is meant to smoothly, without disturbance, fill in as the line of defense on behalf of the state, responsible not only for not only correction, but identifying and recuperating economic threat and loss. The speaker's address on the contest between labor and capital and the teacher's role to resolve it comes 2 months after 8 socialists were hung, accused of bombing the police at the Haymarket Rally, May 4th, 1886. The teacher is positioned here as the ideological guard of the state, literally enforcing the limits of order. This role, the moral and gendered contours that condition it, have been historically traced by scholars like Jave Jones, but what Wells is making evident must also be read along scholars who directly interrogate the racialized dimensions of emancipation as well. For that, I will draw from the work of Thavolia Glimpf and Saidiya Hartman. So Jones says that in 19th century England, the public school teacher was ideologically formed around the good, as both model of and enforcer of traits such as, end quote, modesty, humility, gentleness, end quote. The traits of obedience that Wells described as easily controlled in the passage we just read. These become feminized traits through the refiguration of the male teacher as the marker of paternal law to the female teacher trained to serve paternal law, i.e. the mother teacher. Once the female teacher was figured as such, there was now a basis to naturalize these traits as feminine, when in actuality they were what was operational to the state. But what troubles the somewhat linear narrative of the teacher and the ease at which the logic of paternal law unfolds into the purity of woman mapped onto the teacher is the simultaneous construction of Black women as inherently immoral. As white-led Black education begins in the US in the 19th century, the mother-teacher model was replicated, but now, in addition to a class logic, it could move along an anti-Black logic. Writing on how white women saw and depicted themselves in relation to Black women as teachers, Thavolia Glimpf says, in quotes, Northern white women would be the mothers to the Black race, end quote, filling in for what they saw as the deficiencies of Black mothers and children. Glimpf says, in quotes, laziness, sulkiness, and viciousness define the character of Black children and their mothers, end quote. This narrative shaped the need for white teachers in the South and strategically employed an ideology of dependency that was not real, rather it was productive. Saidiya Hartman details the narrative work of slavery as dependency, saying that this work denies captivity and sets up the assignation of blame and payment of debt required in freedom. Formerly enslaved people were taught by the Freedmen's Bureau that their independence was their individual responsibility. Hartman says this logic of individual responsibility constructed the logic for not just the financial debt, but also, in quotes, moral remittances, end quote. Similarly here, I'm drawing out the construction of dependence between white teachers and Black women during Reconstruction that positions them as inept and needing to prove themselves otherwise as a condition of freedom. That proof comes through the perfect expression of a ladylike refinement, making gender the conditioning agent to shape the teacher-student dynamic. Thus, for Black women teachers, the moral remittance is both responsibility to their gender formation and their racial management. Their responsibility to morality is not just a duty to carrying out gender. It is a racial debt to be paid off for entry into gender. So I'm going to just shift here to what is coming up next in this paper. And I'm not going to read the next part of the paper, but just kind of tell you my plans and the shape it's taking. So as I continue to develop this, I want to return to Wells's speech of 1891 that I mentioned in the beginning, that she wrote the year she got fired. In this speech, she keeps the language of leading the race that we read in the story of 1900, but has shifted it a bit. Now it's not based in the duty to the state in exchange for entry, but rather stages a contest between labor and capital, where she's formulating organized Black labor as the solution to prejudice, where she says the Black laborer, in quotes, needs to be taught how to utilize that power for his own benefit, end quote. This directly confronts the teacher's duty to nation as dictated by the NAE, where Black women are squarely positioned to lead not just as part of their duty as the teacher, but as payment to the nation. In this confrontation, she moves us to the edges of education and what it seeks from the Black woman teacher. She again produces the tension, that tension between what she wants from education and what it aims to do. So what I hope the framework of this paper opens up is that we don't need to figure out what she thought about gender definitively to travel with her as she moves through it and where she reveals these locations of gender making. It is not something she resolves, but something that she keeps pressing on her entire life. And it is in the absence of a resolution that she shows us where it is at work and how. And what I find over the larger arc of this essay, following the tensions that she produces and what they make visible about the conditioning of race and gender for the teacher, is that where they are put at odds for the Black woman teacher, i.e., paying off a racial debt for entry into gender, the intensity of the call to prove oneself human intensifies, and Wells leaves it bare and exposed. Okay, so I will stop sharing my screen there and come back. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much for sharing your research. It was quite an insightful. Thank you so much. It was quite an insightful research and a very interesting topic. I was able to learn a lot from it, from your presentation. Uh, I'm also glad the fellowship has been able to help you to shape the research, and you're able to, come up with resources that are really helpful. So that's really good. So now I'll just open the floor for questions. So we have a couple of people. So we just want to see if there are questions for you, maybe things you could maybe like expand on or clarify. So if you have questions, please you can type it in chat, or you can unmute and then ask your question.
I'm already unmuted, so I'll
Okay.
sort of throw a question out there. I'm wondering if you can, first of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. It's really thoughtful, provoking, and I um, I do work that's focused on libraries and curiosity, and I nerd out on curiosity, and I have like all these citations to share, and I will not burden you with that because
No,
I'm
I
sure
would
you
love
have
to.
enough to read. But there's one that I will share. It's this is very library science focused,
Okay.
but the way that there's a kind of gendered othering within libraries
Mm,
mirrors, I think, or at least is similar to what happens in the field of education.
mm,
And there's this really impactful article from a few years ago that I'm putting in the chat about a concept that the author calls vocational awe.
mm,
And it's this way that the awe that is encouraged of the profession of librarianship makes creates it sort of smooths the path for abuse. That's just my interpretation of it, but you can take a
yeah,
look. And that concept could be useful somehow, or the citations in the paper. But again, it's in library science, in the
mm,
library science literature, and I'm sending thoughts and prayers toward the author because I know she was having some health issues. Um,
mm.
and this is really impactful work that she did in, I think, 2018.
That's super helpful. Thank you. That does sound like what I'm working through, thinking about, and so I will absolutely take up that resource.
Um, and so that's not exactly a question. And so here's my actual question. Um, I wanted you to tell us a little bit about your process in the archives that you visited, which archives you visited, and where your curiosity was most sparked, or where any stories that you have about your process. I always love to hear stories about people engaging with archives, BMRC archives, of course, in particular, but um, any discoveries that you made, or anything you'd like to get back to,
Hmm.
if that's not too big of a question.
I think there's more to get back to than I can, which is a good thing, right? I I was in the Ida B. Wells papers, so it's one archive with think 12 boxes. And it's funny because the first, I didn't go in order. I think I started with box 8, and I didn't really know what was in there. Like I said, I was wanting to wander. And the first thing I read was that quote that I shared about her responding to the preacher and kind of this defense of her womanhood and her purity, essentially. And it was unsettling to me because I was not sure what to make of it. And I think um, so much of this research has been around like dwelling in that what is unsettled, because what I'm finding unsettled, she also is leaving unsettled, and maybe necessarily like it's not meant to be resolved and kind of understood in that way of this is what she thought about gender. And so I think what why I was so kind of drawn to these moments where I feel why I kind of describe it as the force of gender making is because they just kept showing up. And I think the more I kind of think about my research as like the educators that I'm following, they kind of guide me back into a larger archive of Black education. And so pointing me to specific moments where like it becomes so obvious and profound how much of this profession is conditioned by race and gender, and in what ways, because a lot of it is intentionally covered, and kind of like what you said, like how certain what those coverings are require a lot of unpacking and searching, and so untangling, I guess. And so yeah, so my process was kind of to go meander a little bit, but I was very organized in my note-taking strategy. So I was kind of detailing what stood out and why as I went, because I knew that if I kind of just took pictures and tried to come back to it later, it would be too overwhelming. So I was kind of going through each box, and I had a lot of the materials digitized. So I was able to kind of sense what I was interested in before going. And that slide I showed you in the beginning with the kind of intersplicing of her work was something that I had done using the digital material. But what you don't get a chance to do digitally is wander. Like you can't actually find what you're not looking for in the same way. And so I kind of took that initial curiosity and just kind of steadily went through the folders, noting instances that were sparking new directions, taking kind of notes on that. And I don't know if this is like too much too much detail on the process, but I also created like a chart of where the connections between the findings as I was going, which was really helpful. So that when I kind of sat down to piece things together in writing, essentially I was doing it already along the way. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Oh, no, definitely. And I don't want to hog up all the space. I probably have 80 more questions. It was a thought-provoking talk, and I'm kind of fascinated by the work. But I'll pass the mic to others.
There's another question in the comment. I don't know if you can see it. I can read it out. So in Ada B. Wells' writing, she spends a lot of time writing about making a living and struggling to earn enough money. Teaching teaching has historically been an acceptable, in quote, way for women to earn money. Did the writing indicate to what degree choice to teach was one of economic necessity, perhaps more than desire? What
Yeah.
can you tell motivated her to teach? I don't know
Yeah.
if you.
I think you kind of name it in the question that it was an economic necessity. So she started teaching after her parents died, and she was responsible for her siblings. And so she needed a job. And that was what she was prepared to do, or like she could do, and it wasn't so much a desire. And I think um, it that kind of builds over time in the diary, but I don't think she thought it would be what it was still, even though it wasn't her first choice. I don't think she thought it would be so confining. And for example, like she could not get promoted to teach past third grade, even though she wanted to. So there were, and there were these constant expressions of her being misinterpreted and kind of tattled on or talked about in ways that were not true. And so there's a lot influencing what it is that made this a challenging time. But yeah, I appreciate the question.
That was a good question because I've also seen people, it reminds me about, I've seen people who have also taught out of economic necessity because they just needed a job, survival, not really because they had passion for the teaching profession. So I've seen that happen over and over again because people can't get other opportunities. So yeah, so people are less motivated with what they do. They just want to do it to keep up with economic demand. So that was a
Yes.
great question.
And I think it's something that I'm working to address in my larger work, because it, like you said, is the case for a number of people. And during this time in the 19th century, the kind of economic pressure combined with the like moral obligations that I'm kind of discussing around gender and race are like coming together. And so it's sort of hard to talk about it as one or the other because they're so intertwined. But yeah, I'm working on how to weave that in.
Okay. You have another question. I don't know if you have the energy for more questions. So, this is a follow-up question from Kim, the same person who asked the previous question. So, does the historical record say much about Black women who ended up teaching? I don't think she was unique. It's just,
I think if I'm interpreting it correctly, maybe it means about why they ended up teaching. And I do think, like you're saying, it was not unique that many um, women were kind of moved into this role for what we just discussed, the kind of economic pressures, and also um, also there is a lot of, there is not a lot, there is some scholarship about the kind of promise of this profession to be an escape from some of the more confining professions that Black women held at that time. And that is kind of like the point of departure for me, that it's meant to be, or it's said to be something, somewhat of an escape. And yet it kind of further entrenches the same forces that are making up the world, as I said. About
okay.
the historical necessity and how they felt about teaching. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
So I don't know if you have other questions for Maria. Okay, Steve?
I'm just sharing this from one of my. Again, I do research on curiosity quite a bit, and I would just your when you were talking about how you go about your research, this quote came to mind from Hurston. That research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose. It is
Mhm.
seeking that he who wishes may know the cosmic secrets of the world, and they that dwell within.
Yeah, right. You have another
So
question from Kim.
that's a good one.
If it's a good one, yeah. So Kim says, if Wells was alive today and you could ask her one question to help your work, what would you ask her?
No, don't apologize. I appreciate the questions and that it engages you. I I don't know. It's funny because so I mentioned that my research is kind of driven by my own work in education and also my grandmother. And I think while my grandmother was alive, I would ask her questions about teaching or kind of her life in general. And there was so much that she did not want to answer. And I I think part of researching in this way is a way to understand and be curious without needing to know the innermost details of somebody's life. And I really try to kind of balance that um, privacy and honor what is not said on purpose without also while also honoring my curiosity and want to know, you know, what we're doing here and the legacy of the work. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what I would ask her because I kind of would just want to know what she would want to tell me. But I do just think it's such a privilege to be able to have materials that she left behind because we don't have that for every teacher.
So I don't know if anyone else has any questions. We're almost ending. So no hands raised, no questions in the chat. So yeah, for me, just look forward to your to you publishing the research, either like in your thesis or as a research paper or in a book chapter. So we're looking forward to reading more about your work and just learning more about this interesting topic you've been working on. So thank you again for presenting on this topic, and I thank everyone for being able to spare the time to attend this presentation. I know this is lunchtime, and giving your time to be part of this presentation. So we thank you all for attending and for the presentation. So uh, I'm going to stop recording now because this is the end of the presentation, and then I'm going to stop recording now, and then the recordings will be available online in about 1 or 2 weeks. So you can go back and reflect if it was anything you probably skipped. You can think about it or something. So yeah, so it will be online for it will be on the BMRC YouTube page, so you can look out for it. And I also notify you when it's been released online. So thank you so much once again, and I'm going to stop recording now.